The night I turned 16, my father looked at me like I was a stranger and said, "I won't have a thief in my house." I wasn't a thief, I had never stolen anything. But my sister Lily stood behind my parents with tears streaming down her face, and that was all the evidence they needed. By 10 p.m., I was standing on the front porch with a backpack and $43 to my name. No goodbye, no second chance. Just the sound of the door locking behind me and the cold October air cutting through my jacket. 20 years later, my face appeared on Forbes magazine. 72 hours after that, my mother texted me for the first time in 2 decades. "We need a family meeting." They didn't ask where I'd been. They didn't ask how I survived. They asked for $85,000 for Lily's wedding. I sent them $1 and a note that said good luck. What happened next brought the police to my door. And what they uncovered about that night 20 years ago about Lily's lie was something I never could have imagined. Have you ever discovered that the worst moment of your life was never what you thought it was? My name is Hannah George. I'm 36 years old, the founder of a financial consulting firm I built from nothing, and according to Forbes magazine, one of America's self-made women. What the article didn't mention is that my journey started on a cold October night when my own family threw me away like garbage. That question has haunted me for 2 decades. And now, sitting in my corner office with my mother's text glowing on my phone, I finally have the chance to find out. I read the message again. "Congratulations on Forbes. We need to talk. Mom." 12 words after 20 years of nothing. No happy birthdays, no Merry Christmases, no "Are you alive?" Just silence stretching across 2 decades like a held breath. And now this. I wasn't surprised they'd found me. I'd been waiting. What surprised me was how empty I felt. No anger, no hope, just cold readiness like a soldier who'd spent years preparing for a battle that had finally arrived. To understand what that text meant, you have to understand what my family was, or rather, what I was to them. Growing up, I learned early that there were two sets of rules in our house, one for me and one for my younger sister Lily. When something went missing, I was questioned first. When arguments happened, I was told to apologize, to be the bigger person, to stop being so difficult. Lily watched and learned. She discovered that tears were currency in our household, that accusations against me always stuck, and that I made a perfect scapegoat. It started small. A broken vase that Lily knocked over became my fault. Allowance money that disappeared from her room led to my belongings being searched. A bad grade on her report card somehow connected to me being a bad influence. By the time I was 14, I had stopped defending myself. The verdict was always the same. Why waste my breath? But there was one person who saw through it all. Grandma Rose. She was my mother's mother, and she watched our family with knowing eyes that missed nothing. A month before she died when I was 14, she pulled me aside during a Sunday dinner. Her hands were thin and spotted with age, but her grip was strong. "I see what's happening in this house," she said quietly. "I've written something for you. It's with my things, and I'm leaving you my ring, the one your grandfather gave me. Don't let anyone take what's meant for you, Hannah. Promise me." I promised, but I never found that letter. After Grandma Rose passed, my parents let Lily go into her room first to choose some keepsakes to remember her by. When I finally got my turn, the jewelry box where Grandma kept her treasures had already been picked through. The ring was gone. So was any letter with my name on it. I told myself Grandma must have been confused at the end, that the letter didn't exist, that the ring had been misplaced. I told myself a lot of things back then. I was wrong about all of them. 2 years after Grandma died on the night of my 16th birthday, everything came crashing down. $200 went missing from my mother's purse. Lily's accusation came wrapped in tears and trembling hands. But I noticed something in that moment, something I'd carry with me for the next 20 years. There was a pause before Lily's tears started. Just a beat, like an actress waiting for her cue. And when our parents turned to me with that familiar look of disappointment, Lily's expression flickered. Just for a second. It wasn't distress, it was satisfaction. That was when I understood. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a sister's mistake. This was the final move in a game I hadn't even known we were playing. I thought that night was about $200 I never took. I thought it was about a lie my sister told. I was wrong. The money was just an excuse. The lie was just a tool. What really happened that night was something I wouldn't understand for 20 years until I saw what Lily had hidden in Grandma's jewelry box. The night my parents threw me out, I walked until my feet ached. I had nowhere to go, no plan, nothing but $43 and a backpack full of clothes. I was 16 years old, and the people who were supposed to protect me had just told me I was worthless. That first night, I slept on a bench in the park near my high school, too afraid to close my eyes, too exhausted to keep them open. By morning, my whole body was stiff from the cold, and I understood something that would shape the next 20 years of my life. No one was coming to save me. If I wanted to survive, I would have to save myself. The first year was brutal. I couch surfed with friends whose parents looked at me with pity and suspicion. I worked 2 jobs, one at a diner before school and another at a grocery store after. I fell asleep in class and woke up to teachers asking if everything was okay at home. I learned to lie with a smile. Everything's fine, just tired. My grades slipped, but I refused to drop out. Finishing high school became my obsession, the one thing I could control, when everything else had fallen apart. I graduated with dark circles under my eyes and a diploma that felt like a middle finger to everyone who had expected me to fail. During that first year, I tried to reach my parents 3 times. The first was a letter I wrote 2 months after they kicked me out. I poured my heart onto that paper, explaining that I hadn't stolen anything, begging them to reconsider. I gave it to Aunt Margaret to deliver because I was too afraid to go back to the house myself. She promised she would. Weeks passed. Nothing. The second attempt was a phone call, also through Aunt Margaret. She said my parents weren't ready to talk, that they needed more time. The third was another letter, this one shorter, less desperate, just asking if we could meet somewhere neutral to talk. Again, silence. Aunt Margaret always had the same sad answer. They're still angry. Give them time. They'll come around eventually. I believed her. I thought my parents were stubborn, but that eventually blood would win out over pride. I thought they just needed space to realize they'd made a mistake. I was so naive. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn for nearly 2 decades, was that my letters had arrived. My parents had read every word. And each time they'd softened, each time they'd considered reaching out, Lily had been there to stop them. She told them I had called her, that I'd said terrible things about them, that I blamed them for ruining my life, and wanted nothing to do with any of them. She painted me as the villain, the ungrateful daughter who had run away and was now trying to manipulate them with fake apologies. My parents believed her because they had always believed her. And so the letters stopped coming, the silence grew permanent, and I spent years thinking my family simply didn't want me back. The truth was so much worse. They had been told I didn't want them. When I was 22, working full-time and taking night classes to finish my business degree, Aunt Margaret let something slip during one of our rare phone calls. She mentioned that Grandma Rose's estate had been settled years ago and asked if I'd put my inheritance to good use. I went cold. What inheritance? Aunt Margaret's voice changed, became nervous, evasive. She tried to backtrack, but I pressed her until she told me the truth. Grandma Rose had left $50,000 to each of her granddaughters, with instructions for our parents to distribute the money when we came of age. But when the time came, my parents had decided that since I had abandoned the family and rejected all contact, my share should go to Lily instead. They said it was what Grandma would have wanted, that the money should stay with the family member who actually valued family. $50,000. Gone. Given to the sister who had orchestrated my exile in the first place. And the worst part was that it was technically legal. The will's language was vague enough that as executors, my parents had discretion. They hadn't stolen from me. They had simply decided I didn't deserve what was mine. I could have fought it. Even at 22, I knew I had grounds for a legal challenge. But I was barely surviving, working 60 hours a week while carrying a full course load. I had no money for lawyers, no energy for a court battle that could drag on for years. And honestly, the thought of facing my family in a courtroom, of having to prove I deserved basic human decency, made me sick. So I made a different choice. I decided that I would build my own fortune. I would become so successful that the $50,000 they stole would look like pocket change. And when I was ready, when I had resources and power and proof, I would get my answers. This wasn't forgiveness. This wasn't moving on. This was patience. The kind of patience that looks like acceptance, but feels like sharpening a knife. I built my company over the next decade slowly and deliberately. I started with nothing but my degree and my determination. I made connections, learned from my mistakes, reinvested every profit back into growth. By 30, I had a real business. By 33, I had a successful one. But I stayed invisible. I avoided press coverage, declined interview requests, kept my name out of the spotlight. Twice, Forbes reached out about featuring me in their Self-Made Women series. Twice I said no. I wasn't ready yet. I was still gathering my ammunition. The turning point came when I was 33. Aunt Margaret, weighed down by years of guilt, finally told me something that changed everything. She confessed that Lily had been the one feeding our parents those stories about hateful phone calls that never happened. The communications I thought were being ignored had actually been poisoned before they ever had a chance. For 17 years, Lily had controlled the narrative, making sure my parents believed I was the monster while she played the loving daughter. That was when I stopped being a survivor and became a strategist. I hired a private investigator, then a lawyer. For 3 years, I gathered documentation, the will, the estate records, the timeline of Lily's lies. I learned that Grandma's letter, the one she'd promised me before she died, had never been found. I mapped out 2 decades of manipulation and theft, and when my case was ready, I chose my battlefield. At 36, I finally said yes to Forbes. This wasn't about recognition or ego. It was about creating a public record of who I was, establishing my credibility before the confrontation began. It was about making my family come to me instead of the other way around. Most importantly, it was about giving Lily a reason to panic. I had learned something valuable over the years. Panicked people make mistakes. Desperate people reveal themselves. The article ran, 72 hours later, my mother's text arrived. The trap was set. For 3 years, I had gathered evidence and built my case. But I was still missing the most important piece, the answer to why. Why had Lily worked so hard to erase me completely? The money was significant, but $50,000 didn't explain 2 decades of relentless manipulation. There had to be something more, something deeper. That answer would come from Lily herself in a moment when her perfect mask finally cracked. I chose the location for our meeting carefully. A coffee shop in a downtown hotel lobby, busy enough to feel public, quiet enough to have a conversation. More importantly, I knew the hotel had security cameras everywhere. Whatever happened there would be a record. I arrived 15 minutes early, ordered a tea I had no intention of drinking, and watched the entrance. My heart was steady. I had waited 20 years for this moment. A few more minutes meant nothing. They walked in together, a united front. My parents looked older than I expected, smaller somehow, as if the years had compressed them. My father's hair had gone completely gray. My mother moved more slowly, her face lined in ways I didn't recognize. For a moment, something stirred in my chest, something that might have been grief for the relationship we never had. Then I saw Lily, and the feeling vanished. She looked exactly the same, polished, poised, performing. Her smile was bright and warm, the kind of smile that fooled everyone who didn't know what lived behind it. She hugged me like we were close, like she hadn't spent 2 decades erasing me from the family. I let her. I was gathering information, not seeking connection. We sat down, and for 45 minutes, we made small talk. They asked about my company, my Forbes feature, my impressive journey from nothing to something. My mother said she'd shown the article to all her friends at church. My father nodded along, adding occasional comments about how he'd always known I had a head for business. Lily praised my determination, my independence, my strength. Not once in those 45 minutes did anyone mention the past. Not once did they ask where I'd lived that first year after they threw me out. Not once did they wonder how a 16-year-old girl had survived alone with $43 and a backpack. Not once did they ask if I'd been safe, if I'd been scared, if I'd ever needed help. They hadn't given. It was as if those 20 years of silence simply didn't exist. As if I had chosen to leave and they had graciously allowed me to go find myself. My mother said something that made my blood run cold, though I kept my face perfectly neutral. She said, "We always knew you'd do well, Hannah. You were so independent even as a teenager. Some children just need to find their own way." I recognized the rewrite immediately. In their version of history, they hadn't thrown away their daughter. They had set her free. They hadn't abandoned a child. They had released an independent spirit. The lie was so complete, so polished, that I wondered if they even remembered the truth anymore. Maybe they had told themselves this story so many times that it had become real to them. Or maybe they simply didn't care. Then came the reason they were really there. Lily announced her engagement to a man named Daniel Morrison. Old money, she said. Family connections, very prominent in the community. The wedding would need to be tasteful, but appropriate to his family's expectations. She showed me her ring, a diamond so large it looked almost vulgar. The total cost of the wedding, she explained, would be around $120,000. They had already placed deposits totaling $35,000, knowing that I would want to contribute to my only sister's happiness. The remaining amount needed was $85,000. I listened as my mother explained that family helps family, that this was what Grandma Rose would have wanted, that it was time to put the past behind us and come together for this joyous occasion. The same Grandma Rose whose $50,000 they had given entirely to Lily. The same past they had just spent 45 minutes pretending didn't exist. The audacity was so complete, so breathtaking, that I almost admired it. Almost. I had prepared for this moment for 3 years. I knew exactly what I was going to say. I spoke calmly, keeping my voice soft and even. Before we discuss the wedding, I have a question about that night. The night you asked me to leave. The atmosphere at the table shifted immediately. My father's hand tightened around his coffee cup. My mother's smile became fixed, artificial. Lily's eyes narrowed just slightly, the first hint of something beneath her polished surface. The $200 I supposedly stole, I continued. Did you ever find it? Silence. The question hung in the air between us like smoke. It's a simple question, I said. After I left, did the money ever turn up? Did you ever find it somewhere you'd forgotten? Did it fall behind a drawer, get mixed up with other bills, show up in a coat pocket? My mother looked confused, genuinely confused, as if she had never considered the question before. I don't remember, she said slowly. It was so long ago. I turned to Lily. Do you remember, Lily? You were so certain I took it. You cried when you told them. You said you saw me do it. Surely you remember what happened to that $200. Lily's response came too fast, too sharp, her voice rising just slightly. That was 20 years ago, Hannah. Why are you bringing up ancient history when we're trying to talk about my wedding? I smiled just a little. Because I never took it. I never took a single dollar from anyone in this family. And I think you know that. For a moment, something flickered across Lily's face. Not guilt. Lily didn't feel guilt. It was irritation, the irritation of someone whose carefully constructed narrative was being questioned. Then her mask came back, but differently this time. Harder, colder. Her voice dropped the sweetness it had carried all morning. You were always jealous of me, she said. Always playing the victim. You have all this money now. You were just on the cover of Forbes. You can obviously afford to help your family, but instead, you're sitting here making everything about yourself and your feelings. Some things never change. There it was. The real Lily just for a second. The sister who had watched me be thrown out into the cold and felt nothing but satisfaction. I filed the moment away in my memory. I would need it later. I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and thanked them for their time. I said I would consider the request and be in touch. My mother looked hopeful. My father looked relieved. Lily looked suspicious. She should have been. 1 week later, a courier delivered an envelope to my parents' home. Inside was a single dollar bill and a handwritten note on plain paper. The note said, "For Lily's wedding. This represents what my presence in this family was worth to you. I hope it's enough, Hannah." The dollar wasn't a reference to any specific memory. It wasn't about bus fare or spare change or anything that had actually happened. It was a mirror. I was showing them exactly how they had valued me. $1 for 16 years of being their daughter. $1 for the night they threw me away. $1 for 20 years of silence. My phone rang 17 times that afternoon. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I already knew what came next. I knew what would happen because I understood something about Lily that our parents never had. She had spent 20 years as the family's protected princess. She had never been told no. She had never been challenged. She had never faced consequences for anything she had done. And people who have never faced rejection don't handle it well. They escalate. They make noise. They do desperate things to punish whoever dared to defy them. Lily would come after me now. She would try to hurt me the way she thought I had hurt her. And in her desperation to make me pay for that $1 insult, she would open doors that had been sealed for 2 decades. Lily did exactly what I expected her to do. For 2 weeks after receiving that $1 envelope, she left furious voicemails on my phone. She demanded that I stop playing games. She called me petty, childish, ungrateful. She said I was embarrassing the family and that I needed to act like an adult. I saved every single message but never responded to any of them. My silence drove her crazy. Lily had spent her entire life getting reactions from people, and my refusal to give her one was more insulting to her than anything I could have said. So, she escalated just as I knew she would. She convinced my parents to accompany her to the police station, where she filed an official report claiming I was harassing the family and that I had stolen family heirlooms years ago. She wanted the police to do something to punish me, to force me to apologize, and pay for her wedding. It didn't work out the way she planned. The police called me for a phone interview. I explained the situation calmly and offered to provide documentation. The officer on the other end sounded almost embarrassed on Lily's behalf. He told me that sending $1 to a family member wasn't harassment, and that if there was a property dispute about heirlooms from 20 years ago, that was a civil matter for the courts, not the police. No charges were filed. No further action was taken, but Lily had done something she couldn't undo. She had made official accusations on the record, and official accusations require official responses. She had just given me exactly what I needed. My lawyer had been waiting for this moment. Within 10 days of the police report, my family received a formal letter on thick legal stationery. It wasn't a lawsuit, not yet. It was something more unsettling. It was a detailed request for documentation. Please provide evidence supporting the claim that Hannah George stole family heirlooms. Please provide estate records showing the complete distribution of Rose Miller's will. Please explain the legal basis for reallocating Hannah George's $50,000 inheritance to Lily George. Please provide any documentation of attempts to contact Hannah George during the 20 years following her departure from the family home. The letter wasn't threatening in its tone. It was worse than threatening. It was thorough. Every question was specific. Every request showed that I already had information they thought was private. It showed that I had been preparing for this for years, that I had documentation, that I knew things they had assumed were buried. For the first time, my family understood that they weren't dealing with the scared 16-year-old they had thrown away. They were dealing with someone who had spent 2 decades building the resources to hold them accountable. 3 days after my family received the lawyer's letter, Aunt Margaret called me. She was crying so hard, I could barely understand her at first. When she finally calmed down enough to speak clearly, she said words I had been waiting 20 years to hear. I can't keep quiet anymore. I've been a coward for so long, Hannah. I'm so sorry. I have to tell you the truth. What she revealed that night confirmed everything my private investigator had pieced together, but hearing it from someone who had witnessed it firsthand was different. It made it real in a way that documents and timelines couldn't. Lily had never intercepted my letters. She hadn't needed to. Every time one of my letters arrived at my parents' house, every time my name came up in conversation, Lily had been there to poison the well. She told my parents that I had called her cell phone and said terrible things about them. She told them I blamed them for ruining my life, and that I never wanted to see them again. She told Aunt Margaret different lie stories about how I had screamed at her and called her names. Each lie was slightly different, tailored to the person hearing it, but they all painted the same picture. Hannah was the villain. Hannah was attacking the family from a distance. Hannah didn't want reconciliation. Hannah wanted to hurt them. My parents had stopped wanting to reach out to me because Lily had convinced them that I hated them. Every time they had softened, every time they had considered calling me or writing back, Lily had been there with another story, another lie, another reason to stay away. She hadn't stolen my letters. She had made sure they didn't matter. 6 weeks after Lily filed that police report, everything began to fall apart for her. Daniel Morrison, her wealthy fiancé, had noticed something strange about his bride-to-be. She had become obsessed with the $1 incident in a way that didn't make sense to him. "It's $1, he had said. Why does it matter so much?" Lily's explanations grew more erratic, more emotional, more unhinged. She couldn't let it go, couldn't stop talking about how I was trying to ruin her life, couldn't stop calling her mother to vent and rage. At their engagement party, surrounded by his family's wealthy friends and business associates, Daniel overheard something that changed everything. He heard Lily on the phone with our mother, her voice shrill and furious. She was screaming that I was trying to ruin everything just like I always did. She said that I was always Grandma's favorite, and that I couldn't stand that she had finally gotten what she deserved. Daniel had never heard Lily mention a grandmother's favoritism before. The story he had been told was that I had abandoned the family, that I was the black sheep who wanted nothing to do with anyone. He had never heard me described as anyone's favorite. He started asking questions that Lily couldn't answer without unraveling her entire carefully constructed history. Around the same time, Aunt Margaret made one more confession. Months earlier, while helping Lily pack her things to move into Daniel's apartment, she had found a small box hidden at the back of Lily's closet. Inside was a ring she immediately recognized. Grandma Rose's wedding ring, the one she had promised to leave me. And beneath the ring, still sealed after all these years, was a letter addressed in Grandma's handwriting to my Hannah. Aunt Margaret had been too afraid to take the box or say anything at the time. She was ashamed of that now, but she could describe exactly where it was hidden, exactly what it looked like. When Daniel, now deeply suspicious of the woman he was supposed to marry, went looking for answers, he found the box exactly where Aunt Margaret said it would be. He opened the letter and read it. Then he brought both the ring and the letter to my lawyer. Grandma Rose's words, written 22 years ago when I was 14 years old, finally reached me. She had written that she saw something special in me, something the rest of the family was too blind to notice. She believed I would rise above the smallness of this family. She wanted me to have her ring as a reminder that I was loved even when the world made me doubt it. She hoped I would know that someone had seen me, truly seen me, even if no one else ever did. Lily had hidden this letter for more than 2 decades. She had stolen the ring Grandma meant for me to have. And suddenly, the whole picture became clear. The money had never been the point. $50,000 was a nice bonus, but that wasn't why Lily had worked so hard to erase me. She had needed me gone because she couldn't bear that Grandma had seen me as special. Not her, me. Lily's entire identity was built on being the favorite, the golden child, the one everyone loved best. Grandma's letter threatened that identity in a way she couldn't tolerate, so she had made sure I would never see it. She had made sure I would disappear. Daniel ended his engagement that same week. He told Lily only 5 words. I don't know who you are. He walked away from the wedding, the deposits and the future Lily had been counting on. Her carefully constructed life collapsed around her. My parents, confronted with Grandma's letter and Aunt Margaret's testimony, couldn't deny the pattern anymore. But the question that finally broke them wasn't about the money or the lies or the inheritance. It was simpler than that. I asked them, "Where did I live after you threw me out? Do you even know?" They didn't. They had never asked. They had never looked. For 20 years, their 16-year-old daughter could have been dead in a ditch somewhere, and they wouldn't have known. They hadn't cared enough to find out. My parents sat in their living room with Grandma's letter in their hands, and they finally understood what they had done. They looked at me with something I had never seen from them before. Not love, not guilt, fear. They were afraid I would treat them the way they had treated me. They didn't know that I wanted something much simpler than revenge. I wanted Grandma's ring on my finger, and then I wanted to be free. Freedom, I discovered, comes with paperwork. My lawyer spent the next several weeks negotiating a settlement that would avoid the mess of public litigation while still delivering accountability. Lily didn't want a court case any more than I did, though, for very different reasons. I wanted to move on with my life. She wanted to hide what she had done. In the end, we reached an agreement that gave me everything I needed and cost her everything she valued. Lily was required to return my $50,000 inheritance plus reasonable interest over the 22 years she had kept it from me. The total came to $87,000. The irony was not lost on anyone. They had asked me for $85,000 for her wedding. Now she owed me more than that. There would be no wedding, of course. Daniel was gone, and with him went Lily's dreams of marrying into old money and social prominence. But the financial settlement was only part of her consequences. Because she had filed a false police report accusing me of harassment and theft, she faced potential misdemeanor charges. My lawyer made it clear that I was prepared to push for prosecution if necessary. In exchange for me not pursuing that path, Lily agreed to 100 hours of community service and a formal written statement acknowledging that her accusations against me were completely unfounded. It wasn't prison, it wasn't dramatic justice, but it was a record and official acknowledgement of what she had done. And for Lily, who had built her entire identity on being perfect and beloved, having her lies documented in black and white was devastating. My parents requested a meeting after the settlement was finalized. I agreed to see them once, just once. We met at the same hotel lobby where we had discussed Lily's wedding, though this time the atmosphere was very different. My mother cried before I even sat down. She offered money, offered apologies, offered anything to make this right. She said she couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stop thinking about that night 20 years ago. My father sat in silence beside her, looking older than I had ever seen him. The hardness that had always defined him seemed to have cracked, leaving behind something hollow and tired. I let them talk until they ran out of words. Then I said what I had come to say. I told them I didn't need their money. I had built everything I had without them, and their dollars meant nothing to me now. I told them I didn't need their apology. I had been healing for 20 years without it, and I would continue healing whether they were sorry or not. What I needed them to understand, I said, was simpler than money or apologies. I needed them to understand that they had made a choice that night. They chose to believe Lily without evidence. They chose not to look for me afterward. They chose their own comfort over their own child. That choice had consequences that I had to live with every single day for 2 decades. I survived those consequences. I built a life despite those consequences. But I didn't owe them forgiveness just because I survived. Forgiveness wasn't something they could ask for like a favor. It wasn't something I was obligated to give just because they finally felt bad about what they did. My mother sobbed. My father stared at his hands. I stood up, told them I wished them well, and walked out. I haven't seen them since. I don't plan to. Grandma Rose's ring fit my finger perfectly, as if it had been sized just for me. I wore it on my right hand, not hidden and not displayed, just present. A quiet reminder of the woman who had seen me when no one else did. Her letter, the one Lily had hidden for 22 years, now sat framed in my home office where I could see it every time I worked late. I see something special in you. Those words, written by a dying woman who wanted to make sure her granddaughter knew she was loved, had finally reached their destination. 22 years delayed, but not too late. The $87,000 from the settlement went into a separate account. I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it, and it had nothing to do with spending it on myself. The weekend after everything was finalized, my real family gathered at my apartment for dinner. Not the people who shared my blood, but the people who had chosen me when choosing me was hard. Aunt Margaret was there, the woman who had finally found the courage to tell the truth after 2 decades of guilty silence. I had forgiven her truly. Forgiven her because she had been afraid and imperfect, but ultimately she had done the right thing when it mattered most. Rachel was there too, my college roommate who had opened her tiny studio apartment to a desperate young woman with nothing but $43 and a dream. Marcus came, the mentor who had believed in my business plan when every bank in the city had turned me down. These were my people. These were the ones who had stayed when staying required sacrifice. We ate too much food and drank good wine and laughed until our faces hurt. Rachel told the story she always told at these gatherings, the one about the night I showed up at her door, soaking wet from the rain, telling her I was going to build an empire someday. "Remember what you said?" I asked her. She grinned. I said, "Okay," and handed you a blanket. That was what family meant. Not blood, not obligation, choice. The choice to show up for someone when showing up is inconvenient. The choice to believe in someone when belief requires faith. The choice to stay. I used the recovered inheritance to establish something that would outlast me. I called it the Rose Miller Scholarship, using my grandmother's maiden name. The fund would support young women who had been abandoned or estranged from their families and needed help completing their education. Girls like me thrown away by the people who should have protected them, trying to build futures out of nothing. The first recipient was a 19-year-old named Jessica who had been kicked out of her home for reasons her family called irreconcilable differences. The real reasons didn't matter to me. What mattered was that someone believed in her when her own family didn't. Grandma Rose had seen something special in me. Now, I would see it in others. 6 months after the settlement, I received a letter at my office. There was no return address, but I recognized Lily's handwriting immediately. She had written 3 pages filled with accusations and justifications, and something that might have been an apology if Lily had ever learned how to actually apologize. She wrote that I had ruined her life, that I had destroyed her relationship and her reputation and her future. She hoped I was happy with what I had done. Then near the end, she wrote something that told me she would never change. "Grandma was wrong about you," she said. "You're not special. You're just lucky." I read the letter once, then fed it through my office shredder. Lily still didn't understand. She never would. And that was no longer my problem. People ask me sometimes if I hate my family. The answer is complicated. I hated what they did to me. I hated the years I spent wondering what was wrong with me, why I wasn't worth loving. I hated the silence and the lies and the way they rewrote history to make themselves the victims. But hate takes energy, and I spent too many years with too little energy to waste any of it on them. What I feel now is something quieter. I feel free. I feel whole. I feel like the girl who walked out of that house at 16 with $43 has finally been told that she was right to keep walking. Grandma Rose wrote that she saw something special in me. She was wrong about one thing. It wasn't special, it was just stubborn. Stubborn enough to survive. Stubborn enough to build. Stubborn enough to wait 20 years for the truth. My parents lost 2 daughters that night they threw me out. They just didn't know it yet. Lily is still there, still performing, still trying to be the only child. But she's performing for an audience that finally sees the act. And me, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Surrounded by people who chose me. Wearing my grandmother's ring. Building something that matters. The family that threw me away spent 20 years forgetting I existed. I spent 20 years becoming someone they could never erase. And now finally, I don't need them to see me at all. I see myself. That's enough. That's everything. Thank you for staying with Hannah's story until the very end. Before you go, I want to share some thoughts that I hope will stay with you long after this video ends. Hannah's journey teaches us something important about family and self-worth. The people who share your blood are not always the people who deserve your loyalty. Family is not just about biology. It is about the people who show up for you, who believe in you, who choose you even when choosing you is hard. If you have people like that in your life, hold on to them. They are your real family. This story also reminds us that silence is not always peace. For 20 years, Hannah's family maintained their comfortable silence while she struggled alone. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are not the ones who yell or fight. They are the ones who simply look away and pretend nothing happened. If someone in your life is being treated unfairly, your silence makes you part of the problem. Speak up. It might be uncomfortable, but it matters. And finally, remember this. Your worth is not determined by the people who failed to see it. Hannah spent years wondering what was wrong with her, why she wasn't worth loving. The truth was that nothing was wrong with her. The failure belonged to the people who couldn't recognize her value. If you have ever felt unseen or unappreciated by people who should have loved, you know that their blindness says everything about them and nothing about you. If this story touched your heart, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me what part of Hannah's journey resonated with you most. Have you ever had to walk away from people who didn't value you? Have you found your own chosen family? Your stories matter, and I read every single comment. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and tap the notification bell so you never miss our next story. We share new stories every week about resilience, justice, and the strength it takes to rebuild your life when others try to tear you down. Thank you for being part of this community. Until next time, remember that you are worthy of love, respect, and a family that chooses you back.